What if I told you that a single man, rising from the dusty plains of Persia, built an empire so vast it stretched from the Aegean Sea to the edge of India? And what if I also told you that this same empire, born from brilliance, strategy, and vision, would one day crumble in a single thunderous clash against a young Macedonian king at Gaugamela? The story of the Achaemenid Persians is not just about kings and battles. It's about ambition and betrayal, golden palaces and secret couriers racing across thousands of miles, and the fragile line between power and collapse. Cyrus the Great carved the first chapters with blood and genius, while his successors fought to hold the throne of the world. Yet, destiny had a cruel twist waiting, one that not even their vast armies or glittering wealth could prevent. Stay with me as we journey into a saga that begins in the deserts of Persia and ends in the dust of Gaugamela. Because once you know how the Persians rose, ruled, and fell, you'll see history itself in a new light. Subscribe, lean in, and let's step into the fire of empire. The birth of a world conqueror, land of harsh beginnings, long before the Persian Empire became the largest the world had ever seen. The land of Persia itself seemed an unlikely cradle of empire. Picture it, a rugged plateau scorched by the sun, where jagged mountains cut across the horizon and water is scarce enough to make survival a daily challenge. Here, in the 6th century BCE, tribes scratched out a living, herding animals across the dry plains and relying on the mercy of a land that offered little comfort. But sometimes, it is from hardship that greatness emerges. The Persians were not born into luxury or safety. They were a people hardened by their environment, tough, resourceful, and patient. Yet at the time, they were hardly a force to be feared. Their more powerful neighbors, like the Median Empire to the north and the Babylonians to the west, looked at Persia as little more than a backwater. No one could have imagined that from these modest beginnings would rise a man who would shake the ancient world. That man was Cyrus. To his people, he would be known as Crus. To history, he would be remembered as Cyrus the Great. But greatness never announces itself at birth. It begins quietly, with whispers. And the whispers surrounding Cyrus's birth were filled with prophecy, danger, and blood. A dangerous prophecy. The story begins with a dream so terrifying that it changed the fate of kingdoms. Astyages, the last king of the Median Empire and grandfather of Cyrus, dreamed that his daughter Mandane's child would one day overthrow him. In the ancient world, kings often feared dreams, for they were believed to be messages from the gods. This one was too ominous to ignore. When Mandane married a Persian nobleman named Cambyses, Astyages grew uneasy. If the dream was true, the child she carried would not only dethrone him, but also destroy the Median dynasty. And so, when Cyrus was born, Astyages ordered a brutal command. The infant must die, but fate does not bend easily to human will. Harpagus, a Median noble tasked with carrying out the order, could not bring himself to murder the baby. Instead, he entrusted the child to a humble herdsman. The boy grew up in the mountains, playing among shepherds, learning endurance, and hardening his body and spirit far from the luxuries of court life. Cyrus should have remained hidden, forgotten in the folds of history. But even as a child, he showed unusual leadership. Stories say that when he played games with other boys, Cyrus always assumed the role of king, commanding the others with a natural authority that was impossible to ignore. One day, this playful charade brought him before Astyages himself. The Median king, recognizing the spark of something too dangerous to suppress, realized that the boy before him was none other than his grandson, the child he had tried to erase. It was too late to kill him now, for even Astyages feared divine punishment for slaying his own blood. So Cyrus was allowed to live, sent back to his true Persian family. The prophecy had not been destroyed, it had only been delayed. The young prince of Persia, by the time Cyrus returned to Persia, he was no longer just a child of prophecy. He was a prince. His father Cambyses ruled over the Persians, though under the shadow of Median authority. Cyrus grew up watching the uneasy balance of power, learning the art of politics as well as the art of war. The Persians were vassals to the Medes, forced to pay tribute and bow to Astyages. For a proud people hardened by struggle, this was a bitter humiliation. Whispers of rebellion stirred, but few dared to act until Cyrus came of age. He saw not only the resentment of his people, but also the cracks forming in the Median Empire. Astyages had ruled too long, and his once loyal nobles grew restless. Among them was Harpagus, the same man who had once spared the infant Cyrus. Harpagus never forgave Astyages for forcing him into that moral dilemma. He nurtured his resentment for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Cyrus emerged as a bold young leader, Harpagus saw in him not only the fulfillment of prophecy, but also the perfect instrument of revenge. The first flames of rebellion when Cyrus finally raised the banner of revolt. The odds were against him. The Medes were powerful, their armies trained and disciplined, while the Persians were fewer in number. But Cyrus possessed what Astyages had lost: the loyalty and fire of his people. His rebellion spread like wildfire, fueled by the longing of the Persians to throw off their chains. Harpagus secretly betrayed Astyages, convincing key Median commanders to abandon their king at the moment of greatest need. When the final battle came in 550 BCE, the Median army crumbled, not from lack of strength, but from lack of loyalty. Astyages, once the most powerful king of the region, was captured by his own grandson. Cyrus had done the impossible. He had overthrown the empire that had once ruled over him. And in doing so, he became something far greater than a rebel or a usurper. He became the founder of a new empire, the Achaemenid Empire, the conqueror's vision. But here lies the true genius of Cyrus. Many conquerors rise by the sword and fall by the sword. Cyrus, however, understood that lasting power could not be built on terror alone. He had seen the cruelty of Astyages, the heavy hand of rulers who crushed their subjects with fear. Cyrus chose a different path. Instead of destroying the Medes, he united them with the Persians. The two peoples became one, bound together in a new empire. His conquests that followed in Lydia, Babylon, and beyond were marked not only by military brilliance, but also by a revolutionary approach to rulership. When he captured Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus did not plunder the city. Instead, he declared himself chosen by the Babylonian god Marduk, restoring temples, freeing captives, and respecting local customs. The Jews, exiled in Babylon, were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Such policies earned Cyrus not only obedience but admiration. To his subjects, he was not a foreign conqueror but a liberator. The legend begins, and so, the man once hidden in the mountains became a legend in his own lifetime. Cyrus the Great was not merely a warrior, but a builder of civilizations. Under his leadership, Persia transformed from a minor tribe into the center of the world's first true superpower. But if his rise seemed unstoppable, history reminds us that no man, no matter how great, is immune to fate. In time, Cyrus too would fall not at the hands of prophecy, but on the battlefield, fighting the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. His death was sudden, but his empire endured, carried forward by his heirs. Yet even in death, Cyrus's legacy was unmatched. He had created something new, an empire that stretched across continents, ruled not only by fear but by respect. His tomb at Pasargadae, a simple yet enduring monument, still stands today as a silent testament to the man who began it all. Reflection: as the dust settled after Cyrus's conquests, the world had changed forever. A new power dominated the horizon, one that blended cultures, languages, and traditions into a single vast tapestry. But with this new power came new challenges. Could the empire he built survive the ambitions of those who followed him? Or would the same cycle of prophecy, betrayal, and rebellion return to haunt the Persians again? The answer lies not in Cyrus, but in his successors. And their story takes us deeper into both glory and tragedy, as the Achaemenid Empire expands, fractures, and finally collides with a force it never anticipated: the armies of Alexander the Great. Kings of Fire and Empire, kingdom without its founder when Cyrus the Great fell in battle around 530 BCE. The empire he left behind stretched farther than any kingdom before it. Yet, empires are fragile things. They may look unshakable, but their strength lies not only in walls and armies, but in leadership. Cyrus had united Persians and Medes, respected his subjects, and laid the foundation of a new world order. But now he was gone. The question loomed: who would inherit his impossible crown? The mantle passed to his son, Cambyses II. To most, Cambyses seemed destined for greatness. He had been raised in the shadow of his father's conquests, steeped in the lessons of empire, and eager to prove himself. But history would remember Cambyses not as a wise ruler, but as a man consumed by ambition, cruelty, and paranoia. And yet, in his chaos, the empire expanded. The paradox of Cambyses is that while his reign darkened the Persian throne, it also carried the empire to new horizons. The march into Egypt, Cambyses' greatest ambition, was Egypt, the land of the Nile, of colossal monuments and ancient dynasties. The pharaohs had ruled for thousands of years, wrapped in the mystery of gods and pyramids, and few outsiders had ever dared to challenge their power. But Cambyses saw Egypt not as a sacred land, but as a prize dot in 525 BCE. He led his armies westward, across the deserts, into the heart of Africa. The Persians clashed with the Egyptian forces at the Battle of Pelusium, near the Nile Delta. What happened there has become one of the strangest stories in the annals of war. The Egyptians held cats sacred, believing them to embody the goddess Bastet. Cambyses, ever ruthless and cunning, is said to have ordered his soldiers to paint cats on their shields, and perhaps even drive live cats before the Persian lines. The Egyptians, terrified of harming their sacred animals, hesitated. In that hesitation, the Persians struck. The Egyptian defenses crumbled, and Cambyses marched triumphantly into Memphis. Egypt, the eternal land of the pharaohs, had fallen. For the first time, a foreign king now claimed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Cambyses styled himself Pharaoh, adding another jewel to the Persian diadem. Madness in Memphis, but conquest did not bring peace to Cambyses. Instead, it seemed to unhinge him. Ancient sources describe a spiral of madness. Cambyses desecrated Egyptian temples, mocked sacred rituals, and committed acts of shocking cruelty. He allegedly killed the sacred Apis bull, a living symbol of divine blessing, plunging Egypt into outrage. Worse still, Cambyses turned on his own family. His brother Smerdis, also known as Berdia, became the target of his paranoia. Convinced that Smerdis might challenge his throne, Cambyses ordered his death. But in eliminating his brother, Cambyses planted the seeds of chaos that would soon consume the empire. For as Cambyses lingered in Egypt, far from the Persian heartland, whispers began to rise. A man claiming to be Smerdis appeared in Persia, declaring that he had survived his brother's treachery and was the rightful king. Whether this man was truly Berdia or an impostor remains one of history's great mysteries. What mattered was that the people believed him, the false king. As Cambyses prepared to return east to crush the usurper, fate intervened. During the journey, he suffered a wound, some say by accident, others by divine justice. The wound festered, and Cambyses died before he could reclaim his throne. The empire was now leaderless, thrown into confusion. Across Persia, nobles and soldiers alike pledged loyalty to the man on the throne, whether Berdia reborn or a clever, Imposter. But among the Persian elite, suspicion brewed. This smarties seemed unfamiliar with the nobility, uninterested in the traditions of Persia, and disturbingly secretive. The truth began to emerge. He was not Bardia at all, but a Magian priest named Gaugamela, who had seized the throne under false pretenses. The deception could not last. Within months, a group of Persian nobles, led by a man named Darius, plotted to strike down the impostor. One fateful night, they stormed his palace and killed him. The throne of Persia was once again empty. The question returned: who would wear the crown of the world? Darius the Great, from the shadows of crisis, emerged one of history's towering figures. Darius I, unlike Cyrus, who had seized the throne through rebellion, or Cambyses, who had inherited it, Darius claimed legitimacy in a new way. He declared that the gods themselves had chosen him. Carved into the cliffs at Behistun in western Iran is his great proclamation, the Behistun inscription. In it, Darius recounts how the false king had deceived the people, and how he, with divine aid, restored order. The inscription, written in 3 languages, stands as both history and propaganda, a testament to the power of words and stone in shaping empire. But Darius was more than a usurper who justified his rule. He was an organizer, a builder, and a visionary. Under his reign, the Achaemenid Empire reached its golden age, not only in size but in sophistication. The machinery of Empire Darius understood that holding together an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus required more than armies. It required structure. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces governed by satraps, or local governors, who collected tribute and enforced royal authority. To ensure loyalty, Darius kept a close watch on his satraps. The king's eye and the king's ear. Spies loyal only to him traveled the empire, reporting back on corruption and dissent. It was an early form of intelligence gathering, a secret web of power that made rebellion nearly impossible to hide. Darius also revolutionized communication. He built the Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, dotted with stations where fresh horses awaited couriers. Messages that once took months could now cross the empire in days. Herodotus would later marvel. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course. The Persian postal system had been born, and with stability came prosperity. Darius introduced a new currency, the gold daric, which became the lifeblood of trade across his vast territories. For the first time, merchants could carry a coin that was trusted from Egypt to India. The empire was not just political. It was economic. A king among kings to his subjects, Darius was more than a ruler. He was king of kings, a title that captured the essence of Persian power. The empire was not one people ruling another, but many peoples bound together under a single throne. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Indians all paid homage to the same king, yet retained their own traditions. Darius built palaces that embodied this vision. At Persepolis, he raised a capital like no other. Grand halls supported by soaring columns, walls carved with scenes of tribute bearers from every corner of the empire, each in their native dress, carrying gifts for the king. It was both art and message. Persia was the world, and the king stood at its center. But even as he built, Darius prepared for war. For the empire he commanded was so vast that peace could never last. And across the sea, in the scattered cities of Greece, a storm was gathering, one that would test Persia's might as never before. The first clash with Greece began in Ionia, the western coast of Asia Minor, where Greek cities lived under Persian rule. In 499 BCE, they revolted, seeking aid from their kin across the Aegean. Athens answered the call, sending ships to burn Sardis, one of Persia's key cities. To Darius, this was not merely rebellion, it was an insult. The Athenians had dared to strike at the empire of the King of Kings, and so he swore vengeance. According to legend, he ordered a servant to remind him each day at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Persian army marched into Greece in 490 BCE, landing at Marathon. The clash that followed would become legend. The Persians, vast in number, faced the smaller Athenian force on the plain near the sea. Yet in a stunning reversal, the Greeks triumphed. The Persians retreated. Their invasion shattered Dot for the first time. Persia had been stopped. The empire still loomed vast and powerful, but a crack had appeared. Reflection Darius had built more than an empire. He had built a machine. Roads, spies, satraps, and palaces gave Persia a strength no kingdom had ever matched. Yet for all his brilliance, even Darius could not command fate. His dream of conquering Greece would be left unfinished. When he died in 486 BCE, the throne passed to his son, Xerxes, a man who would take up his father's vow of vengeance. The stage was set for one of the greatest clashes of East and West the world had ever seen. Xerxes and the clash of East and West. The shadow of a promise when Darius the Great died in 486 BCE. He left behind not only a vast empire, but also an unfulfilled vow: vengeance against the Greeks. His son Xerxes inherited both the crown and the promise. From the moment he ascended the throne, the ghost of Marathon hung over him. The defeat of Persia's armies at the hands of mere city-states was an insult that could not be forgotten. Xerxes was not his father. Where Darius was patient, Xerxes was impetuous. Where Darius built, Xerxes burned. Yet in him burned the same ambition to bring the rebellious Greeks to their knees and show the world that no one could defy the King of Kings. But ambition, as history so often reminds us, can be both the engine of glory and the spark of ruin. A king's fury, the preparations for war were unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes summoned men from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, Thracians, even nomadic Scythians from the steppes. Together, they formed an army so vast that ancient writers spoke of millions. Though modern historians estimate closer to 250,000, still a force beyond imagination for its time. The fleet, too, was enormous, drawn from Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian ships. The empire stretched across 3 continents, and Xerxes intended to bring its full weight crashing down upon Greece. But even before the war began, nature seemed to mock the Persian king. When storms destroyed his first attempt at building a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, Xerxes, in a fit of rage, ordered the waters whipped with chains. He even had the engineers who failed him executed. It was a strange glimpse into his mind, a king who believed he could command not only men, but the very elements. Thermopylae, the pass of heroes in 480 BCE, the great invasion began. The Persian army marched west, crossing into Europe with thunderous steps. Greece, divided as always into rival city-states, stood on the brink of destruction. But in their darkest hour, the Greeks found unity, however fragile, Dot at Thermopylae. A narrow mountain pass, a small force of Greeks stood waiting. Among them, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas. They knew they could not win. Their purpose was not victory, but defiance to hold back the tide, to show the world that Persia's might could be resisted. For days, the Greeks held the pass, their discipline and armor blunting the waves of Persian soldiers. Xerxes watched in frustration as his massive army was stalled by a handful of men. At last, betrayal tipped the balance. A local guide revealed a hidden path, allowing the Persians to encircle the defenders. Leonidas and his Spartans fought to the last, their sacrifice seared into memory as a symbol of courage against impossible odds. Thermopylae was a victory for Xerxes, but a costly one. The Greeks had lost the battle, but they had won something greater, Hope fire on the Acropolis with Thermopylae behind him. Xerxes swept into central Greece. Athens, the heart of the rebellion, lay before him. The city was evacuated, its people fleeing to the island of Salamis. Xerxes entered the empty city and, in a gesture meant to break the Greek spirit, set fire to the Acropolis. Flames devoured temples and statues, smoke rising like a dark crown over the ruins. To the Persians, it was triumph. To the Greeks, it was outrage. The burning of Athens became a rallying cry, a reminder that their freedom and their very civilization were at stake. The trap at Salamis, but Xerxes, for all his fury, underestimated his enemy. Themistocles, the cunning Athenian admiral, lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, the great numbers of the Persians became their weakness. The massive ships, crowded together, could not maneuver. The smaller, more agile, Greek triremes struck with deadly precision. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on the shore as his fleet descended into chaos. What was meant to be the final blow to Greece turned into disaster. The Persians were crushed, their ships shattered, their sailors drowning in the waters of Salamis. For the first time, Xerxes faltered. The invincible king of kings had been humiliated before his own eyes. Retreat, and, reckoning though, the Persian army still dwarfed that of the Greeks, Xerxes' confidence was broken. Fearing that supply lines would collapse and rebellions might ignite across his vast empire, he withdrew, leaving a smaller force under his general Mardonius. A year later, at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, the Greeks struck again. United under Spartan leadership, they defeated the Persians on land as decisively as they had at sea. The great invasion was over. Greece remained free. The turning tide for the Persians. The failure of Xerxes' invasion marked the beginning of a long decline in their struggle with the West. Though the empire remained vast and powerful, the aura of invincibility had cracked. For the Greeks, it was the dawn of a new age. The victories at Salamis and Plataea inspired a flowering of culture, democracy, and philosophy that would shape the Western world. Yet even in their triumph, the Greeks never forgot the shadow of Persia, the empire that had nearly extinguished them. Reflection: Xerxes had sought to avenge his father and prove Persia's supremacy. Instead, he became a cautionary tale of hubris. His arrogance, his belief that numbers alone could crush spirit, led him into traps set by smaller but sharper foes. The empire survived him, still mighty, still rich. But the balance of power had shifted. The West had tasted victory, and Persia's enemies had seen that the giant could bleed. As Xerxes returned to his palaces, surrounded by splendor, yet haunted by failure. The seeds were sown for a new chapter, one in which Persia would face not just Greek city-states, but a rising force unlike any it had ever known. And that force would come in the form of a young Macedonian king named Alexander. The fraying crown, a king in shadows. After the bitter failure in Greece, Xerxes returned to his palaces in Susa and Persepolis. The fires of Salamis still haunted him, but to his people, he remained the king of kings. The empire stretched from the Indus to the Nile, its wealth overflowing, its palaces glittering with gold. On the surface, Persia looked untouchable, but power often decays from within, long before enemies strike from without. Beneath the grandeur, cracks widened. Xerxes himself withdrew into indulgence, surrounding himself with luxury and intrigue. Court politics grew poisonous, with nobles and eunuchs whispering in gilded halls. While assassination and betrayal became common tools of ambition, Xerxes would eventually fall not to foreign swords, but to palace conspirators. Around 465 BCE, he was murdered, perhaps by his own guards. The empire, still vast, now began its long descent through rulers who were heirs to glory but strangers to Cyrus's vision. The weight of empire. The next century of Persian rule was marked by both brilliance and decay. Kings like Artaxerxes I and Darius II managed to hold the empire together, but their reigns were plagued by rebellions, court intrigue, and constant challenges to authority. The sheer size of the empire became both its strength and its weakness. From the Aegean to the Indus, satraps governed provinces with near-kingly power. While some remained loyal, others ruled like independent monarchs, skimming tribute, raising private armies, and playing dangerous games of politics. The King of Kings was supreme in name, but in distant lands, his will was often little more than an echo. Even so, Persia's wealth remained legendary. Gold and silver poured into the treasuries of Susa and Persepolis. The empire's subjects, Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Indians sent tribute in dazzling forms: ivory, spices, exotic animals, and precious stones. Yet wealth can dull vigilance. The kings of this era reveled in opulence, building palaces with soaring columns and feasting in splendor, while their armies, once the terror of the world, grew complacent. The return of Greece, while Persia waded through intrigue, Greece was changing. The victories at Salamis and Plataea had ignited a golden age. Athens rose as a naval power, its fleet dominating the Aegean. The Delian League, formed to resist Persia, grew into an empire of its own. Persia, however, was not idle. Artaxerxes I and his successors learned to use gold as effectively as spears. By funding rival Greek city-states supporting Sparta against Athens, then Athens against Sparta, the Persians ensured that Greece remained divided. Why march armies across the Aegean when Greek silver could be bought with Persian gold? This strategy worked until a new power began to stir in the north. Macedonia, once a backwater kingdom, now rose under Philip II, forging an army unlike any the Greeks or Persians had ever faced. The twilight of glory as the Greeks quarreled and Persia bribed. A new king ascended the Persian throne, Artaxerxes III. Unlike some of his predecessors, he showed flashes of the old Persian strength. He reconquered rebellious Egypt, bringing the Nile back under Persian rule. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might revive, but time had already tipped the balance. When Artaxerxes III died, possibly poisoned by his own vizier, Persia plunged once again into instability. Assassinations, plots, and coups followed, each weakening the throne. By the time Darius III came to power in 336 BCE, Persia was still rich, still vast, but hollow at the core, and fate had prepared his greatest trial. On the western horizon, Philip of Macedon had been assassinated, leaving his son to inherit both throne and ambition. That son was Alexander, Darius III. The last king of kings, Darius III was no fool, but he faced an impossible challenge. He inherited a throne weakened by decades of intrigue, armies that were powerful in number but undisciplined, and satraps who ruled with divided loyalties. He was tasked with defending an empire that had grown complacent against an enemy who had been forged in iron discipline. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, few in Persia took him seriously. He was only 20, a boy king from a small kingdom. Surely the Persian armies, vast as the sea, would crush him as they had crushed countless others. But Alexander was not like others. His army was a machine hardened by Philip's reforms, drilled in the deadly phalanx, and led by a general of almost supernatural charisma. While Persia relied on numbers and splendor, Alexander relied on precision, speed, and the unshakable belief that he was destined to conquer the world. Reflection. By the eve of Gaugamela, Persia still glittered like a crown of gold. But beneath the shine, its foundations had rotted. Kings slain by their own courtiers, satraps ruling like lords, armies bloated but brittle. This was not the empire Cyrus had forged, nor the machine Darius the Great had built. And so, when Alexander marched eastward, the world's greatest empire stood not as a roaring lion, but as a weary giant, rich in treasure but drained of spirit. The stage was set. The son of Macedon would meet the last king of kings, and at Gaugamela, the fate of Persia, and indeed, the ancient world, would be decided. The fall at Gaugamela, gathering storm by 331 BCE, the stage was set for one of history's greatest confrontations. On one side stood Darius III, king of kings, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. On the other, Alexander of Macedon, only 25 years old, but already undefeated, his conquests blazing a trail across Asia Minor, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. The Persian court still dripped with gold, and Darius still commanded armies that dwarfed Alexander's in size. Yet size had deceived the empire before. At Granicus, Issus, and along the Nile, the Persians had already felt the sharp edge of Macedonian discipline. Still, Darius believed he could end this invader once and for all. And so he gathered his forces near the small village of Gaugamela. The plain stretched wide and flat, perfect for the Persian war chariots and cavalry. Darius ordered the ground leveled, removing obstacles so his scythed chariots could cut through Alexander's phalanx. He assembled not just Persians, but troops from across his empire: Bactrians, Indians with war elephants, Armenians, Scythians, and countless others. Some say his host numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Against this, Alexander brought barely 47,000 men. It looked like a battle between a lion and a swarm. But history does not always favor the largest army. The night before battle on the eve of Gaugamela, Alexander's officers gathered nervously in council. Some urged a night attack, a surprise assault to even the odds. But Alexander refused. He wanted the world to see, in the clear light of day, that Macedon could defeat Persia face to face. Darius, meanwhile, spent the night in a gilded tent, surrounded by luxury. Alexander, in contrast, slept soundly beneath the stars, his cloak for a blanket, his soldiers for company. When dawn broke, he rose with calm determination, as if destiny itself walked beside him. The dance of war, the battle began with thunder. Persian chariots, their wheels fitted with scythes, charged across the plain. The ground shook as horses galloped forward, blades spinning to tear through flesh and armor. Yet Alexander had prepared for this. His men opened their ranks, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through, then cut down the drivers in a storm of spears. Darius unleashed his cavalry next, wave after wave crashing against the Macedonian lines. Dust filled the air, arrows rained down, and the clash of iron rang across the plain. Yet Alexander held firm, commanding not as a distant king but as a warrior in the thick of the fight. Then came the moment of decision. Spotting a gap in the Persian lines, Alexander gathered his companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who had followed him since youth. With a cry, he led them in a wedge formation straight toward Darius himself. The king's flight? The charge was like a spear through the heart of the Persian host. As Alexander's cavalry thundered forward, the lines buckled. Dust and chaos swirled around Darius's golden chariot. For a moment, the fate of empires balanced on the edge of a sword. Darius looked out and saw the Macedonian king, his eyes fixed, his spear aimed like lightning. Panic surged through him. Rather than stand and fight, Darius turned his chariot and fled. The sight was devastating. When the king of kings abandoned the field, the Persian army's will collapsed. What had been a grand, ordered host became a storm of chaos, men fleeing, chariots overturned, elephants stampeding. The world's greatest empire had been broken in a single morning. The aftermath: Alexander pursued, but Darius escaped for the moment. Yet the damage was done. Persia's heart was laid bare. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis all opened their gates to the Macedonian conqueror. Alexander, barely more than a youth when he began, now sat on the throne of Cyrus and Darius. Darius himself would meet a tragic end. Betrayed by his own satrap, Bessus, he was captured and murdered in the wilderness of Bactria. Alexander, when he found the body, wept for the fallen king. He draped his cloak over Darius and ordered him buried with honor. For Alexander knew that in defeating Persia, he had ended not just a rival, but a dynasty. The burning of Persepolis, one of the most haunting scenes, came months later, when Alexander entered Persepolis, the jewel of the Achaemenid Empire. Its halls glittered with treasure. Its walls bore the carved images of tribute-bearers from every corner of the world. Here, Persia's greatness stood carved in stone, but in a drunken revel, perhaps urged on by companions, perhaps as vengeance for the burning of Athens, Alexander set fire to the palace. Flames devoured columns and statues, the glow lighting up the night sky. The city built by Darius and Xerxes, the symbol of Persian majesty, was reduced to ashes. Some say Alexander regretted it, that he walked among the ruins in silence the next morning. But the deed was done. Persepolis, the beating heart of the empire, was no more the legacy of the Achaemenids, and so ended the story of the Achaemenid Persians. From the rise of Cyrus the Great, who forged an empire through vision and mercy, to the fall of Darius III, undone by betrayal and the brilliance of Alexander, the dynasty had ruled for over 2 centuries. They had created not just an empire, but an idea, the first true superpower, binding diverse peoples together under one crown. Their roads, their administration, their respect for local traditions, all would echo through history. Even Alexander, though he conquered them, sought to adopt Persian dress, Persian customs, and Persian wives. Rome would later learn from them, and through Rome, so too would the modern world. The Persians fell at Gaugamela, but their legacy endures in every empire that followed. Reflection: what, then, is the lesson of the Achaemenid Persians? That empires rise not only on conquest, but on vision. That wealth and power can blind, while unity and purpose can prevail. And that even the greatest kings, wrapped in gold and crowned with glory, remain at the mercy of fate. From the deserts of Persia to the plains of Gaugamela, the story is not just of kings and battles, but of humanity itself, its ambition, its brilliance, and its fragility.